Hello, my name is Kwasu David Tembo. I'm a lecturer in English literature at Lancaster University. I would like today to draw your attention to issues and debates concerning apartheid, questions concerning discrimination, the manner in which the state brings its repressive and ideological state apparatuses to bear in the pursuit of these particular restrictions, the stringencies that they impose on human beings, specifically young people. And the case study that I would like for us to consider as part of this presentation is 1992's SARAFINA. To begin, there have been many oppressive regimes that have sought to sequester, that means separate people of color from non-white communities, both on the continent and off of it. One of the most clear is the policy of apartheid that was implemented in South Africa. And I'd just like for us to explore the issues and debates pertaining to identity, race, policy, law, repression, power, and the state in this regard. How do these apparatuses come together to not only separate people along racial lines, but keep them separated? What tools does such a practice use or employ? The law, culture, religion? How does apartheid affect identity, self, and community? How can apartheid be resisted? In his hour-long special, the now very controversial Dave Chappelle says the following about apartheid. Quote, "The end of apartheid should have been a bloodbath by any metric in human history, and it wasn't. The only reason it wasn't was because Desmond Tutu and Mandela and all these guys figured out that if a system is corrupt, then the people who adhere to the system are incentivized by that system are not criminals. They are victims. The system itself must be tried. But the only way that we can figure out what the system is if everyone says what they did. Tell them how you participated." End quote. Now, we've all heard the term, seen brutal images, felt the ambient anger and the pain associated with this word, apartheid. Figures in the public discourse like Trevor Noah have been very vociferous insofar as bringing it to a Western consciousness. I myself, having grown up in Johannesburg, was very much aware and inundated with these circumstances directly and historically. In the early 1990s in Johannesburg, the atmosphere was electric. There was a tension in every corner, everywhere. My sister and I were 6 and 8 respectively, but we understood that something important was happening, that the country was changing, that people were scared, angry, and uncertain. And the Truth and Reconciliation trials that Chappelle talks about aired on public access television every day, or every week, certainly. And we'd come home from boarding school, and there were old black women and men crying in booths before judges, lamenting the loss of family and property, crying for justice in all 12 of the country's officially recognized languages. There were also white men and women crying, doing the same, but crying for shame, perhaps, describing in vivid and often traumatic detail what they did and how they participated, what the system itself was, how it was maintained, its goals, its secrets, lies, and violence. It was intense. So we need to contextualize apartheid in South Africa and consider how it is that its resistance was a representation of the audacity of the human spirit. The first European settlers to come to the Cape of Good Hope arrived in approximately 1600. In 1652, Dutch, German, and French settlers came to the Cape for religious and economic motives. Dutch boers, or farmers, began to move north and live with native Africans, and a new culture develops, the Afrikaner, or the white African tribe, according to some. Their language was a mix of Dutch and various African languages. They were devoutly Christian and often very racist. They believed that they were the chosen people in an otherwise hostile world. In 1795, the British seized control of the Cape and surrounding areas, and more Boers are driven north. Many Afrikaners died in battles with natives while adapting to harsh land and climate themselves. And hatred of the British and blacks deepened Afrikaner solidarity. In the Boer War of 1899 to 1902, we see in this particular conflict the British desire for gold and diamonds discovered in Afrikaner lands, or lands claimed by Afrikaners. And a fierce battle ensues. where atrocities were committed on both sides. Britain wins ultimate control and makes South Africa a commonwealth. Independence was granted in 1910, while the Afrikaners made up only 13% of the population. They dominated the government. Now, in 1948, the Afrikaner Nationalist Party gained control of South African parliament and established the system known as apartheid. Apartheid means separateness or apartness and included approximately 317 laws which reserved civil rights for 5 million whites and denied them to 25 million blacks. All citizens were classified by race. Marriage and sexual relations across color lines was made legal. Separate residential areas were established. Whites would have purview and privilege over some of the best, whilst over 80% of the population was crowded into areas which covered less than 13% of the total landmass of the nation. Economic development was outlawed in black homelands. Jobs were made available only in white areas. All non-whites had to carry a passbook at all times. All public places were segregated. Black schools were intentionally underfunded, which is to show that the mechanics of discrimination were very, very, very diffuse insofar as their repressive and ideological techniques. What of resistance? Resistance began in the 1950s. The first outbreak of violence occurred in 1960 and was known as the Sharpeville Massacre of 1969, where, 69 people were killed and 180 were wounded by South African police. Nelson Mandela, figurehead, Nobel laureate, rose to the leadership of the African National Congress, or the ANC, but was arrested in 1964 and imprisoned for 26 years. In the early 1970s, Steve Biko founded the Black Consciousness Movement, patterned after the Black Power movement in the United States. Biko was arrested, tortured, and then killed while in police custody in 1977. In 1976, thousands of students protested in a black township in Johannesburg. This became known as the Soweto Riot. The government killed approximately 600 students and arrested thousands. In 1983, as protests continued, the government declared a state of emergency and 30,000 more blacks were jailed. International pressure began to mount as a response to all of these doctrinaire and repressive and violent practices. South Africa was expelled, for instance, from the United Nations in 1974. They were banned from the Olympic Games in 1976. In 1986, the US Congress banned new investment by US companies. And so apartheid ends. F.W. de Klerk becomes prime minister in 1989, and bowing to international as well as international pressure, negotiations begin at this time. And in 1990, Nelson Mandela is released from prison, and the ANC works with the then standing government to write a new constitution, which would put an end to apartheid. In 1994, Mandela is elected as the first black president of South Africa. And we have this moment in which there's a switch and a fulcrum. A moment of inflection, a watershed for race relations, identitarian relations, political, economic, cultural, and indeed ecological, that describe in so many ways the contours of contemporary South Africa. And what you see here are very well-known images that document some of what I've just described and chronicled. Images here from the March 21st, 1960 Sharpeville Massacre, in which the police and the state and its military factions raised the repressive threshold to some searing heights. We have the Western Township or Southwestern Township conflicts here in 1976. There's a commonality in terms of the way in which segregation played out in Jim Crow United States, as well as apartheid South Africa, as you can see the commonalities here. There was this obvious myth of an Aryan global South, if you will. The Nazi Wehrmacht made it all the way as far south as Namibia. So the spread of this repressive and ultimately racist supremacist ideology was given credence and form in the regimes, not only in Europe, but certainly in quote unquote Commonwealth areas in the global South. There's a clear chronicling and keeping of the history of Black revolutionary spirit coming from Black women in particular, and the risks and the attempt to gain international solidarity, action, and attention are played out in haunting images, such as this one you see before you. So Sarafina from 1992 is ultimately an analysis of the ways in which the youth respond to these superstructural issues and debates. The film stars Lileti Kumalo as Sarafina, Whoopi Goldberg as Mary Masambuko. Mary Makeba plays Angelina. There's a variety of very interesting, well-regarded, and culturally significant Black, African, and American participants in this particular feature, which adds to the sense of gravitas and the necessity of the tale being told. Sarafina is a musical featuring a Black South African girl named Sarafina. It is set in one of the biggest South African townships, Soweto, during the time of apartheid, as aforementioned. The film ultimately reflects the South African youth's view of apartheid, their frustration with the older generation's seeming incapability to fight for freedom and starting their own revolution against apartheid. However, the story really redounds to Sarafina herself, a young girl caught between being a teenager and her search to find her purpose in this superstructural struggle. Sarafina begins with an epigraph and contextualizes the socio-political scenario that informs the film, which reads as follows. In 1976, the apartheid government of South Africa declared a state of emergency, freeing the most repressive elements of its emergency powers. Millions of school children adopted a campaign of resistance. Thousands were killed. The film celebrates their courage. I'd like to end by some concluding remarks concerning how it is that violence plays itself out in this particular film. The famed film critic Roger Ebert has declared and decided that the problem of violence in the film can be noted in his review, which is quite perspicacious and interesting insofar as the tensions that it elicits with regards to the issues that the film is discussing. Is violence, whether perpetrated by an adult or a youth, legitimate tactical contraventions of an otherwise repressive superstructure or strategy adopted by the state? What are the complicities that we have across racial lines and elsewhere in instantiating and maintaining these repressive regimes, or in countermanding them in and through violence as well? Ebert says, quote, Sarafina has been classified as a PG-13 film by the wise people at the MPAA Code and Ratings Administration, who explain the rating in these words, quote, for scenes of apartheid-driven violence. What does that mean? That the MPAA believes all violence is not equally objectionable? That ordinary violence must get the R rating, but if it's driven by apartheid, well, that's a different matter. The most violent scene in the film shows a group of Black school children pouring gasoline on a Black policeman and burning him alive. But the policeman has been revealed as an instrument of apartheid, which apparently means he had it coming to him, and explains that the PG-13 instead of the R is justified. There are also scenes of South African soldiers, Black and white, shooting children dead. So there's this interesting tension between the way in which the film screens in every sense, that it prohibits as well as draws forward the issues and debates concerning violence in repressive regimes, how it is that it can be used to countermand repressive state apparatuses, specifically as doctrinaire and as totalizing as systems of apartheid, or what complicity and ethics prevent violence being leveraged for this pursuit. The film is sincere in its prescription of how it is that a young girl dreams of Hollywood, has aspirations of being a star, but is also extremely parentified. She has to look after not only her ailing father, her mother works in one of the posh, white-owned suburbs in the north of Johannesburg, and there's this labor that is put upon her that is well beyond her years, but is an absolute necessity of the socio-political climate in which she emerges. She is simultaneously a dependent and dependent upon, not only by her family, not only by her educators and people who enfranchise and wish to see her future secure, but also those who require her to participate in these liberation struggles in order to secure those outcomes. So the question remains, is apartheid justifiably countermanded by the instantiation of radical politics of resistance? What is the necessity, the value, or even the utility of violence in their attainment? And how is it that the state can give a recompense, let alone an accurate confessional recounting of how it established itself, maintained its power, who are its agents, at what cost? And at the core of the film also is this desire for knowledge. Ultimately, the cast is young people in a high school who are on the cusp of adulthood in a nation whose future is radically open and uncertain, predicated and based on a rather closed and benighted past. The film also asks questions of what value is education for the repressed? What value is it in this immediate sense of a tool potentially to aid in revolutionary liberation struggles? Or is it something of a distraction ultimately that can actually be bent and become a further instantiation of the tools of the repressive regime? It's a difficult one to answer in any kind of conclusive or straightforward way. As noted in Ebert's rendition of a review of the film, there are moments in which violence springs up intensely on quote unquote both sides of the ideological debate. There are moments in which the viewer is made complicit or called forward in and through an ethical dialogue with themselves and obviously the feature film that they're watching, which asks them whether or not, if they were in that position themselves, found themselves in that regime, in that milieu, would they find violence objectionable or acceptable in pursuit of liberty? What is the cost? What is the fragility? What is the robustitude of liberty? And how is it that these regimes can be recalled, remembered, memorialized, and in some sense not repeated? As a final set of comments, I could conclude by discussing some of the technique of this particular piece. What's interesting for a lot of people is the fact that the mode adopted here by Ruot, the director, is the musical. Oftentimes we think of musicals as part of the mass cultural apparatus that tend toward joviality, that tend toward community, that tend toward celebration, or certainly pathos in terms of heightened emotion in and through the pathos inducing aspects of music as a semiological mode through and which to convey information or feeling or affect. In some senses, it could be argued that a musical for this subject matter are misaligned. One might make the stronger case to say that it is inappropriate for this particular subject matter to be treated in anything resembling a non-historicist, non-cinema verite style, which is tending toward the documentary more than anything else. To say that to include that particular contact and convey it through a scaffolding and machinery that is predicated on song might risk trivializing or leavening the subject matter and denuding it of its necessary puissance as a means of struggle, as a means of liberation, and as a means of countermanding and resistance. However, one could argue the opposite by saying that in using a musical, there are ways to bring a sense of community, to encourage and embolden a broader sense of discourse, that music in and of itself, sung in vernacular in a variety of different dialects of Xhosa, Tswana, Sesotho, Zulu in the film, are a necessary mode in and through which there's a reclamation of Black identity, putting it on the fore and using it as the voice, quite literally and figuratively, to decry, to mourn, as a keening, but also as a critique of that which the song is singing against. So I might leave you with a question of how you think this particular conflict is represented in and through this particular text in this mode, but more broadly, what it is that this text is participating in concerning the contemporary issues and debates that we find ourselves in a global digital milieu. There are many regimes, many climes, many situations on Earth at this time that are similar in ways that make SARAFINA read as eerily prescient or continually relevant. What mode should we adopt as thinkers and critics, as educators and as consumers of media in terms of thinking about how it is that we see these regimes simultaneously enacted in and through film, and in and through media and mass culture more generally, but simultaneously and opposed, how do we see the screening, both in terms of, in its auto-antonymic sense, of screening away, but also putting on screen modes of resistance to these particular regimes? Furthermore, what is our ethical responsibility as consumers of these texts insofar as bringing about the instantiation of that which is screened, both shown and hidden? How do we feel, and what complicity do we have as consumers of these particular medias and mediums? I'll thank you very much for your kind attention. Please consider these texts and these situations as urgent by virtue of the fact that more often than not, people tend to think that these images, these times, these experiences are sequestered to distant history. But as I mentioned earlier, I was alive and more or less aware, despite the fact of not having the perspicuity to understand the details and nuances of the circumstances in which I found myself. They very much happened or resounded within my lifetime. As a matter of fact, my own mother had to flee from Johannesburg, from the southwestern township, to Lesotho in order to avoid the violence at the behest of my grandfather. And so these issues and debates concerning the description of the arc of history are far closer to us than we tend to think. And I think it behooves us to think very, very carefully and very, very critically as scholars and as thinkers and as producers and consumers of mass culture to consider carefully and critically how they function. Thank you very much.